Now we're going to get into the details of the mechanisms of evolution. We talked a lot about the consequences of evolution and how we know evolution is actually occurring. And again, what do we mean by evolution? How populations change over time. Populations, not individuals. That's going to be a key theme throughout the entire unit. So you have all these different words here, these vocabulary words should start to, as we go through the unit, the rest of this section, you should start to make sure you understand what each of these vocabulary words mean. Again, like in the last unit, you have a series of objectives. Make sure you're checking them off as you're going through and trying to understand what we're talking about. And then there's three major concepts that you really want to make sure that you understand. And we've already touched on most of these, but we're going to develop them here in the mechanisms of evolution. So you want to make sure that you understand you're able to calculate the allele frequencies in the population. That you have to try to understand that when you have reproductive isolation, when a population has only a certain set of genes to share, those genes are magnified in the population after several generations. And therefore the traits that they represent are magnified. The natural selection sorts and the variability in gene pools and establishes adaptive genotypes. So again, natural selection is going to be the big driving force of evolution, except for things like genetic drift, where it's random. It becomes natural selection that really makes a difference when you see changes in genotype frequency in the population. So here you have this idea of mutations. It provides the source of new genetic information. We've discussed this. We've even looked at the different types of mutations that exist. You can change chromosomal arrangements. You can even change chromosomes over time. These things all change the genetic makeup. Sexual reproduction then further mixes up the genes. So you things like crossing over, like things like independent assortment, things like recombination when we have sex. We've talked about that in the long run. So when we talk about mixing up the DNA and sex, it becomes really important that we try to understand that genetic variability is the source of that. One of the great sources of genetic variability is sex. Asexual reproduction you do have some genetic variability in that mutations do occur. So mutations are the source of genetic variability in asexually dividing organisms, but sexually dividing organisms mix up their DNA, recombine their DNA all the time. And in fact, every time a new individual is formed, it's a recombination of the genes. It's a recombination, a reassortment of the alleles because of independent assortment and because of crossing over. So when we look at if you have 100 people, 100 ducks, and this is the example we're looking at here is ducks. So you have 100 ducks, and each of those ducks have a different combination of genes. Each one's going to have a different set of codominant, dominant, incomplete dominant organization of genes, and they control everything from color to shape to size to function to abilities. The environment then is going to make certain individuals in that with a certain combination of genes either favorable, or it's going to be favorable or unfavorable. Either those individuals are going to be able to perform well in that environment, or they're not going to be able to perform well in that environment. Either they're going to be selected for, they're favorable, or selected against, they're unfavorable. So if they're unfavorable, they won't live as long, they won't have as many offspring. They won't be able to get as much food, that kind of thing. So, what impacts their ability to be favorable and what environmental factors impact the individual combination of genes, the diets, the pH, the temperature, the wind exposure, sunlight, etc. Then you have selection. This is now natural selection comes in. So you have competition. You have things that prey on the individual. So if the color of the duck is black and they're in an open area, they might show up more than a duck that's has camouflage. If the duck has a thick layer of fat on it, or a thick layer of down, the small feathers underneath the big feathers, they might be able to take the cold temperature better. So climatic factors can start to impact how well, whether that particular duck with its particular set of alleles and therefore its phenotype is in a favorable condition or not favorable. So as conditions change, the selection pressure changes. Natural selection starts to put pressure on the population. Those with the right combination of alleles, with the right phenotype, survive, and those that don't. But since the environmental factors change all the time throughout history, the environment, ice ages, heat waves, now we have global climate change, for instance. Global climate change has happened in the past. It took a longer period of time for it to occur. But as environments change, then selection pressures change. And so that's why we say there's no real direction to evolution. Evolution is just the change that occurs when competition, predators, climatic changes, disease, like COVID-19, etc., start to make choices and which individuals survive and which don't. That impacts the population overall. And so when that population is impacted, then you get a change in the frequency of alleles in the overall population. So as you start to take out those individuals, those unfavorable ones, because they don't have enough small feathers underneath the big feathers, or they don't compete as well against other ducks, or they have they're picked more by predators because they're juicier, they're slower, they're more easily identified in the environment. If they're more susceptible to disease, if they don't have the right combination of genes that help them fight off viruses or bacteria or fungi, and they end up being taken out, then they're part of the unfavorable ones, and they don't have as many offspring. They have a poor reproductive success. They don't have as many offspring. So in the next generation over here, these are the ones with the favorable genes that are going to end up making most of the babies in the next generation. These, only a few of them, if any, move on to the next generation. Their genes move on to the next generation. So that's what we mean by selection pressures. That's how the environment impacts it. Each individual is tested by the environment, is tested by selection pressure. And there's two choices: pass or fail. And if they pass, then their genes pass on to the next generation. If they fail, if any of their genes move on to the next generation. And that's pretty much the process that changes the population, the population, what a population looks like, but which one of these the allele frequencies that you find in any population over any period of time. So selection, discuss this. So you should be able to answer all three of these, and try to understand that this is the process. These are the decision points. This is the map of the decision points and how things occur in the idea of inheritance, and how genes and inheritance impact what they have to do with evolution. Okay, so this word adaptation is any inheritable uh, trait, right, that gives an organism the ability to function well in a niche is an adaptation. So if it's a trait that allows them to be more fit, more able to survive in an environment, in a niche inside an environment, then it's better fit to survive. So the adaptation makes the individual either more fit or less fit. Its particular combination of alleles allows the particular rabbit in this case, and fox in this case, and rhinoceros in this case, to survive in their particular environments. So let's take a look at two rabbits. They look very similar, except this rabbit has big ears and these are small ears. It turns out that their ears are very good at allowing them to regulate their temperature, thermoregulate. All right, so they're able to regulate their body heat, controlling the loss and gain of body heat through thermal regulation, depending on how much heat is lost or through the ears. So the big ears, they radiate the heat out of the rabbit, and the smaller ears radiate less heat. So in the Arctic, those particular rabbits with the genes, the allele combination for small ears survived. Those that had the big ear gene allele combination didn't survive in the Arctic. Why? Because of climate. So the environment, the Arctic environment selected for rabbits with small ears. Where if you look at this rabbit here, which is found in very warm in the southwest, in Mexico, northern Mexico, and Arizona, etc., these jackrabbits have really big ears because it's very hot and they need to release that heat. They still have fur. They need to release that heat, and by having big ears, they're able to release that heat quickly. And in this environment, the selection pressure allowed those with the allele combination for big ears to survive here and therefore the populations of rabbits in these warm areas are made up of big ear genes. So if you have, maybe it's a dominant allele, so most of the rabbits in the desert areas are big B or big B little b, because they're making up these allele combinations. You could have most of them are going to be either one of these. Very few are going to have small ears, because as soon as those small ears are born, they're dead. So there might be some little b small ear genes in the population, but you're rarely going to see the homozygous version of them, if indeed it's just a simple dominant recessive gene, inheritance pattern. Then what you're dealing with is that you're going to see a lot more big B's in this population than you would see little B's. Where if you had in the Arctic, you're going to see mostly little b. You see virtually no big B, because if there are any big B's in a population, it would be hard to see how you could, if it was just purely dominant recessive allele. And remember, it's the inheritance patterns can get very complicated. You could have, these could be controlled by multi-genes, right? So there could be all kinds of combinations that could occur, but just in the simplest way of looking at it, dominant or recessive, you wouldn't expect to see any big B in this population at all, because if they had a big B, the big B would have died a long time ago, because it's dominant. If it has a big B, it has big ears. If it has big ears, it doesn't survive in the Arctic. So almost 100% of these rabbits would be little b, little b. So you see, the gene frequencies were impacted by the environment. That's what we call evolution. Let's take a look at the Fennec fox versus the Arctic fox. So there's this rule that is a pretty straightforward one called Bergman's rule. And it really is just a rule of thumb. It's not some kind of set in stone concept, but the larger the organism, the larger the beast, the better it's able to process heat, to produce heat. So if it's an endotherm, right? If it's a warm-blooded animal, the bigger it is, the more heat it's able to generate through its metabolism. The better it's able to maintain its own heat, especially in the cold, right? So in Arctic areas, the smaller it is, the easier it's able to handle warm areas. Now, as a fat man, I can attest that the fatter I was and am, the warmer I was when smaller people were very cold. So being bigger in the Arctic is an advantage because you're able to keep from losing too much heat. You're able to produce more heat because you're bigger. And you'll notice it has small ear. This Arctic fox has smaller ears. It's a bigger fox, has thicker fur. All this are gene allele frequencies that allow this fox to survive in the cold environment, where the big ears, as we discussed with the rabbit, the thinner fur, the smaller body, all are allele frequencies that allow this fox to survive in the desert. So they look different. The populations in the Arctic are different from the populations in the desert. But that's because natural selection is selected for foxes that are bigger and have thicker fur and smaller ears in the Arctic. And natural selection, again, when I say natural selection, I mean the environment has chosen that these are the ones that will survive because it's cold and in the Arctic, and that these are the ones that are going to survive in the desert because it's hot. So the population gene allele frequencies change in each of these two populations depending on where they live. The environmental impact here, the main driving force here was temperature. But it could have been natural selection. Maybe this is red. Maybe this Fennec fox is red. Maybe in New Mexico there's a lot of red sand, and the Fennec fox, or in the Sahara there's a lot of its color acts as a camouflage against other larger predators. Here the Arctic fox is white and blends in very well with the snow, just like a white polar bear. So it's not just the temperature. It could be predators. It could be food source. It could be, in this case, we're looking at temperature. So it was in this case. Here the rabbit's red. Here this rabbit is multicolored, almost camouflaged. Almost blends in with the background. In the Arctic fox, and the Arctic hare is white in the winter, and of course that makes sense. White rabbit, white snow, blends in. So we looked at the ear size here, but the color has also been impacted by natural selection, just a different form of natural selection. In this case, it would have been color and predators that impacted its ability to camouflage versus the predators gave it this one an advantage in the Arctic and this one an advantage in the Southwest. Here, the Fennec fox had an advantage in the Sahara because of its color. Its coloration allowed it to protect itself from predators. And the Arctic fox's white fur was favored because it had because of where it lived. Its camouflage. White is its camouflage color in its environment against its predators. So there are some traits that don't seem to be directly related to the environment. For instance, rhinoceroses use their horns to, to charge males to see which one is the more dominant and who's going to have the ability to mate. So when it comes to having one horn or two horns, it's not the the great Indian rhino versus the African rhino. The two individuals the environment doesn't seem to have a direct impact. Like we can see clearly the environment defined these characteristics that we discussed up here. But how many horns you have is not directly related to how warm it is or how much water there is or just about any of these things that we've been talking about. So far we don't really know why an African black rhino has one horn and a great Indian rhino has two horns. I mean, one possibility could be sexual selection. Perhaps the females in India, the female rhinos in India, preferred the two horns. Perhaps it's the ancestor of the Indian rhino didn't have any horns, or had a small horn, and then it developed a bigger horn as it started to compete. There's so many traits that we just don't know enough about the species, don't know enough about the selection pressures to really decide what kind of selection pressures led this rhino to have two horns and this one to have one. It could be that the smaller horn is just a mutation that didn't have any impact on survivability, what we call a neutral mutation, that just stayed in the population. Maybe this small little horn came along with is linked to a large front horn. Maybe having a large front horn, the smaller second horn kind of came along with it. Perhaps the molecular signaling mechanism that as we discussed with evolution and development. Perhaps the genes that allowed this rhino to grow this long front horn also influenced the development of second horn, and this second horn has no direct adaptive function, but is the result of the gene sequencing, the signaling that allowed this rhino to develop a large front horn. And since there's no negative impact, since it's a neutral characteristic, this second horn came along with the front horn. The population of Indian rhinos quickly developed this gene combination that gave it two front horns. There's a lot of ways to explain this. No one really knows why this what influenced this two-horn rhino population versus a single horn rhino population. Perhaps there is no advantage at all. Perhaps there is, and we just don't know it. We haven't seen it yet. We haven't identified it. So there's a lot of possibilities here when it comes to this. But there's not necessarily does there have to be a direct selection pressure, a direct advantage, or direct fitness impact? Because a lot of things are inherited that have no real impact. And so they stay in the population. For instance, having tonsils. Don't have them, you survive just as well as not having them. And yet we all have them. It's a neutral characteristic, a neutral inheritance, a neutral gene. It's not an advantage or a disadvantage. If you're a whale, having hind limb skeletal bones, it's not an advantage or a disadvantage. So the whales have them. All right, so you should try to distinguish between adaptive features, genetic, and acclimatization. Acclimatization is when you in the individual, let's say the rabbit changes its fur color from spring to winter. In the winter it has white fur, in the spring it has brown fur. Maybe the dog shedding its fur, its hair, so that it can get its winter coat. Maybe so there's all kinds of things organisms do to get ready for a climate change. Squirrels getting fat before winter, right? A bear gaining fat for its winter hibernation. So these are acclimatization. These are things that organisms do to get ready for a climate change. They might lose weight in the summer in order to deal with the heat better. But adaptive features are things that were inherited. So things like the ability, the ability to change color, change for color is adaptive. Changing the colors, it's acclimatizing. Migration patterns, moving south, the geese flying south for the winter, is a behavior that probably is somewhat genetically related, but its actual moving is not inherited. It's reacting to an environmental change. Birds don't all fly south, especially if you feed them in the wintertime. All right. I think you should be able to explain this in terms of length, size, these two here. And explain that the features high latitude means cold, right? When you're at high latitudes, you're talking about cold weather, cold winters. So what's the better, body size? Here's the length of ears and extremities, etc. And we just talked about acclimatization versus adaptive features. So hopefully that helped you understand the difference between adaptation and fitness. What is fitness? What is adaptation? Adaptation is inherited. Fitness is whether the individual's gene combination is better fit to survive in that environment or not. Hopefully you've looked at the extremity length here and you've listened and you understand how the longer extremities influence your ability to retain heat or lose heat. The body size, how that impacts your ability to retain heat or lose heat, and that not all gene combos, not all traits are necessarily adaptations, right? Not everything can be argued is advantage is something that has to do with fitness. It doesn't have to be. Not everything that's inherited is an advantage or disadvantage in this environment, right? That's something that's kind of a little bit of a twist. It's really kind of an important concept here. So this gene, this second horn, maybe it doesn't have any advantage at all. The first horn, the larger horn, obviously as they run at each other, having a bigger horn is going to allow it to survive and have more babies, so the bigger the horn, the better. Maybe this second little horn doesn't help it at all right now. But perhaps the environment changes, something changes that allows this second horn, for whatever reason, to be an advantage. Then all of a sudden, this is what we see. Or perhaps in the past, that second horn was an advantage. Perhaps the environment in the past had a second horn, allowed this rhinoceros to survive more often than not in the past environment. But since then, the environment's changed, and we don't see a real advantage to it today. We just don't know. So there's a lot of characteristics that when you look at characteristics, you have to think about, are they an advantage, right? Are they an adaptation? They're inherited, but are they an adaptation? Does it make it better fit to survive? If so, how? And then the next question is, could there have been an environment in the past where that second horn was, or that characteristic was an advantage? Could there be a situation where that feature, that trait, was an advantage? Or is this just a neutral gene allele that increases genetic variation and may in the future be an advantage to this individual or this population? These are all questions that are constantly, being asked every time you look at a trait and you consider how that trait and how that trait functions in a population.